Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar regarding November and December AMPS penalties update for ACI noncompliance. Today's webinar will be hosted by BorderConnect's Director of Consulting Services, Debbie Dent. This webinar will go in depth with the new AMPS penalty changes starting November 1st and how this will affect you as a carrier. We will go through the monetary changes, what we will see, and how to avoid them. Included with this webinar is a PDF document of the CBSA penalty notice update, so you can simply download the document attached to this webinar, and for anyone who has questions, please use the chat box or question box, and we will answer your questions at the conclusion. So let's get started. Here's Debbie Dent.
So since January 11th, carriers arriving and not meeting all ACI or e-manifest requirements are now receiving a monetary penalty. As well, non-compliant carriers are delayed at the border and must have an ACI or an e-manifest filed before being allowed to proceed. Empty arrivals, IITs, that empty dunnage that you may be carrying, and CSA, for those of you that are a CSA approved carrier, continues to cause some confusion. And pre-arrival requirements, or ACI, is based on Section 12.1 of the Customs Act and should be reviewed to ensure a full understanding of the carrier and driver's responsibility. Let's go over a little bit of AMPS background. The Administrative Monetary Penalty System, or AMPS, it secures compliance with customs regulations and legislation through the application of a monetary penalty and may apply to multiple parties within any supply chain. Regulations currently do not allow customs to reduce the penalty amount issued. So if you receive an amount of $2,000 and in fact there was evidence that you were in violation of any of the regulation, they cannot reduce or lower that amount. They can only correct it potentially to another or a separate type of AMPS penalty or outright cancel. Canada Customs' definition of mitigation and the U.S. penalty system is much different. For those of you who have received penalty action within the U.S. system, you would receive a penalty commonly in the amount or the value of the merchandise, which may be extremely high, but you could actually, even with admittedly making a mistake, tell Customs the circumstances, the corrective action, and receive a reduced amount that you would have to pay instead. AMPS against ACI ensures that the electronic pre-arrival conveyance and cargo data is sent so that risk assessment prior to the arrival of that truck into Canada can occur. ACI mandatory requirements, all commercial or private carriers, whether empty or loaded, are required to report electronically and at least 1 hour prior to the physical arrival of the truck, unless an exception. There are some exceptions, and they include, for example, a custom self-assessment type shipment or release option is exempt, and then there's some others that still need to report but aren't reported with the detail that's required for shipments. Reporting 1 hour prior to arrival means having both the conveyance and the cargo data on file before that physical arrival. And this has become very crucial as an element when looking at the penalty and what will be potentially coming moving forward. Carriers are encouraged to submit if empty, but currently if a carrier does not submit when the empty truck, and an empty truck is defined as no goods on that truck, if they've not submitted ACI, they are being allowed to proceed without risk of penalty action, and this is going to remain the same. We have not heard any change at this time. Carriers who may be traveling in transit through Canada are also being allowed an interim exemption, and this remains again the same as today. Every commercial carrier for hire must have their own carrier code in order to submit data, and every driver arriving in a commercial truck needs to be prepared to meet the ACI requirement and must have an ACI cover sheet or an equivalent document to support the ACI has in fact been completed and can be found by the officer on arrival. So let's talk about what's changing. So effective November 1st, Customs has announced that they're going to move forward now with multiple levels of penalty action. For those carriers that are on the line that have not received a penalty, or those that you have experienced a penalty, to this point, Customs have been issuing only one penalty action, and if you had multiple penalties over the course of this period, they've just left it at the first level. That is ending as of November 1st. So a carrier who has never received a penalty will receive a penalty at level 1, the same as any of the carriers who have received penalty action as of today. Carriers who have received a penalty, though, at level 1 will receive now a penalty at level 2 if there is a repeated non-compliance. So, for example, that penalty that you've received possibly at $2,000 now goes to $4,000 at level 2. Carriers are reminded they are required to transmit both the cargo and the conveyance data electronically to Customs, and failure to do so now may result in penalties assessed against each non-compliance element. So, for example, if you simply forgot to submit your ACI and the truck arrives at the border, after November 1st, you could not only receive a $2,000 penalty under level 1 for the cargo data that was not on file, but you would also receive potentially a $2,000 penalty for the conveyance data that was not on file. To this point, anyone that has received a penalty has received one penalty action regardless of what was not on file. So action that's to be taken as of November 1st, carriers who receive a penalty action at that level 1 must now maintain their compliance for a period of not less than 12 months from the time the non-compliance was identified to remain at level 1. So, for example, if you have a penalty that gets issued November 2nd, 2016, you have to stay compliant until November 2nd, November 1st, 2017 in order to avoid moving up now in that escalation process. As identified prior to today, penalty is issued against the carrier code, and this has caused some confusion when I've heard a carrier say to me, well, my driver caused the mistake. The penalty should be issued to him or her. The carrier code is what is identifying the carrier, and that is what the penalty is issued against that carrier code. So any non-compliance to a specific carrier code is going to go through this escalation process. And unfortunately, even if that driver is no longer with your company, that driver has caused your history to include that penalty information. Carriers with multiple shipments on board, so carriers that are LTL carriers, they now may receive a penalty action for the multiple cargo shipments that have not been put on file. So it becomes even more critical to ensure that everything is submitted properly, since if I'm a carrier hauling, I send my cargo data, or my conveyance data rather, and I have 12 PARs or 12 shipments on that truck, I could potentially receive that at level 1 $2,000 penalty against each of those 12 that also didn't get submitted because I simply forgot. Keep in mind that 12 months is a long period of time for potentially human error to be avoided, and then it escalates to that 4,000, etc. Now, as well, at the same time, if the November 1st announcement wasn't sort of bad enough for the industry, Customs has said, effective December 1st, that a carrier who has never received a penalty, again, will receive penalty action at level 1. Carriers who have received a penalty at level 2 will now go to level 3. Again, level 3 escalates the amount of penalty action, so that amount now jumps to $8,000 per incident that might be issued by not having that risking factor in place. For those of you on the line, I strongly recommend that after this webinar, you do go in to either Customs website, to this link, and pull out the master document so that you have an understanding and take a good look at the levels of penalty and what penalty action and how it's described. Each new penalty is intended to apply to all submission requirements and all trade chain partners responsible for pre-arrival, including the provision that multiple penalties may be issued per shipment if multiple trade chain partners are in contravention of their respective requirements. Currently, the penalty is based on failing to provide advance information. This is the highest level penalty, and it's that minimum $2,000. But unfortunately, Customs have also taken almost an approach that in every single case, that $2,000 can apply because there was no data on file. So reading the fine print of these AMPS penalty is critical in order to consider or getting any sort of relief to that penalty. Failing to provide advance information in the prescribed time frame or in the prescribed manner. Customs have clearly indicated that the data for advanced cargo reporting and the carrier's responsibility to have that e-manifest filed is 1 hour prior to a physical arrival. And we regularly have trucks that are arriving prior to the 1 hour rule, and although the penalty action related to that is $250, they're being issued the $2,000 penalty because, in fact, they've not submitted all of the data and it's not on file meeting the 1 hour requirement. Failing to correct advance information, failing to provide true, accurate, and complete information. So if there's an error contained in it, even though you may have submitted it, you could be still subject to that penalty action. And we've had a number of carriers who have received a penalty, unfortunately, just simply because the PARS number that was keyed in is not the same as what was actually submitted and linked by the broker. And then failing to comply with any kind of an electronic Customs risk assessment notice. So if Customs, as part of your e-manifest report, should come back and say they wanted some additional information, which we've not seen too much of this yet, you would be subject to, if you reported and arrived and hadn't provided that information that Customs were looking for prior to arrival, then you could be again subject to a very high level penalty. Penalty 378, for those of us that have received it, have been working with this penalty program, is certainly the #1 penalty, and basically the penalty action will read, it was determined that the receiver of the penalty failed to submit pre-arrival or preload data in advance of arrival. And again, I stress first level is at $2,000. Some of you on this phone or on this call that have been in the past received this thought $2,000 was pretty steep for a simple human error. Customs are now going to escalate that as of November 1st to $4,000. And then if you should happen after December 1st to have 2 occurrences against your record, it goes to $8,000. This may apply when a conveyance data is missing, truck, trailer, driver, although the driver data is still not reviewed at this time by Customs, and per cargo data, now the shipment details that is expected to be provided by the carrier. Release arrangements with a Customs broker is considered separate and not included in your carrier pre-arrival or your ACI requirement. Penalty mitigation based on our current rules. Customs' most common reply to noncompliance to contravention 378, and I know this for a fact because I have a number of these on my desk, basically indicates that when the responsible party failed to provide pre-arrival or preload data, contravention 378 can be applied. The prescribed specifications shall be sent in accordance with the timelines. So regardless of the fact that you might have sent it, but you didn't meet that 1 hour prior to arrival rule, it still can be rolled into this 378, which is at the highest level. The timelines, the technical requirements, the specifications, and the procedures as set out in the reporting of imported goods regulations. And of course, the applicable electronic client requirement document that a lot of you would not even be familiar with if you're using a third party like BorderConnect. After we try to get some consideration, basically, the penalty action basically says the enforcement action taken against you was an administrative monetary penalty in the amount of $2,000 in the event that the demand for payment has not been paid in full within 30 days after the date of service of the notice of enforcement action. Interest accrues from the day after the date of service of the notice of the day of the demand payment is made in full, should the penalty be upheld. So in fact, for those of you that may not have paid your penalties, that you got the negative response that the penalty was still owing, they have provided some relief that then interest didn't start to accrue until after that decision had been made. So you may, within 30 days from the date of the mailing of that letter, provide the evidence requested or additional information which may result in your appeal being reconsidered. But unfortunately, our experience to this date is we've put all the facts in the original mitigation or the request for consideration that went in, and we don't have anything else to justify. So basically, penalties that have been issued are almost primarily payable under the current rules. So your options after receiving an AMPS is to remit payment in Canadian or US dollars payable to the Receiver General for Canada, and to make that full payment within the 30 days. You also have the ability to request a correction action. If you believe the penalty action taken was incorrect, you may request a review within 90 days. And this can be done through what we call an e-filing or an e-appeal. You can also request a redress, again within 90 days of penalty action, requesting consideration as a result of a systematic problem affecting your commercial information systems or related processes. The unfortunate thing about that is, again, there's very limited systematic problems that might occur in this ACI world. So what Canada Customs have sort of done is they have applied rules that sort of made sense for importers and that accounting of duties and taxes, which may be caused by the calculation, the system not calculating. They've now tried to put the same rule in place against ACI, when in fact there really isn't a whole lot of systematic issue to ACI. You've either sent it or you haven't. So what can you do? Ensure all personnel, drivers included, understand these new regulations. Talk to your drivers. Unfortunately, we perform a service as well where we're doing that e-manifest on behalf of a carrier, and when communicating with the driver, you know, the drivers have told us, I'm not waiting. I've been sitting here, I'm going. And I'll, you know, so it's very, very, very important for there to be now a very high level of communication between dispatch operations and that driver, that you know exactly what that driver is going to do and that he's not going to come to the border prior to everything being in place. Update your processes and your standard operating procedures that now might actually be obsolete or just not working. If you depend on someone else to fax paperwork, check it was received. Check before going off shift to ensure that all e-manifests are properly submitted. Do not assume anything under this new system, because assumption that everything is going to go according to plan is primarily what has caused a number of carriers that I've worked with to experience penalty action. If that penalty action is received, analyze why the penalty was issued, what steps to change the circumstances that might have created the problem, because 100% of the penalty action is commonly based on human error. Nobody's going out deliberately not wanting to send this. They either didn't know about the regulation, you know, they're maybe seasonal, haven't crossed the border for a period of time. or simply somebody forgot to push the button, or everything was created, or they pushed the button under the shipment part and sent the shipment and didn't send the complete manifest. Watch for postings on our front page. Watch for regular updates from Canada Border Service agencies or other industry association partners. Check the facts, though. Not all information being provided by Customs, especially the officers, and not to criticize the officers on the line, but there's different interpretation of the rules, and suddenly everybody's trying to verify, is that true or not? I received one of those calls again today. So what another carrier or another driver may tell you is not maybe total fact. So it's very important to ensure that wherever you're getting your information, that it's as true as can be, and then basically true based on your specific circumstances. Customs system does go down regularly and may not receive the data, so check that as well. We've had incidents where we've been able to prove to Customs that the carrier filed everything, it was submitted, we could go back to the background information, see that it got sent to Customs system and connected, and still we were receiving a penalty and not having that penalty reduced or canceled. And I shouldn't use the word reduced because there is no such thing as a reducing that amount, but that penalty stood because it was the carrier's responsibility, is what was in the penalty response, to ensure that the data had been received and everything was on file and accepted prior to that truck's arrival. So I can't stress enough, check, check, recheck before that truck arrives at the border. Make your opinion heard, because this is a really contentious issue. I've talked with many carriers. I've talked to many levels of government. I attended a meeting on June 22nd that was hosted by the OTA, the Ontario Trucking Association, and we tried to get Customs to understand. Since then, I've talked to various levels of government. I had a meeting recently with a member of Parliament in Sarnia who was willing to send a letter on our behalf to the Honourable Ralph Goodale, who's the Minister of Public Safety, and this sort of falls under his regime. My suggestion for anyone that's on this call is take the time to post a letter to this minister and make him understand the impact this could have on your business. Continue to be vocal, contact your local transportation associations. The rules as they are right now are punitive. They're not corrective because they don't leave any room for human error to have occurred, and are definitely causing hardship to the transportation industry, and are going to as they continue to escalate. And I get that. I understand that. I've been trying to be very vocal on the carriers that we represent, and in fact, even those that I just randomly get a phone call because they've gotten a penalty, I've taken those and tried to move it forward to get some sort of change to the regulations. Now, the good news, since we put this webinar together, there is another webinar that's going to be hosted on October the 25th with Customs officials. It is going to be hosted by the OTA, and we're hoping, and I'm hoping, that there will be some more changes that could be coming, and that Customs may at least decide to withhold the change that they're proposing here for November 1st, and sort of let's just stay at status quo. Status quo was bad enough to receive a $2,000 penalty, even if you've made that mistake a couple of times, because I do have several carriers, unfortunately, that are already at the point that as of December 1st, they would be facing $8,000 penalties for noncompliance because they're well within the year and they've already received two $2,000 penalties. Again, that one of those same carriers, they have their heavy LTL where they might have 10, 12, 15, 20 shipments on a truck. 8,000 times whatever that 10, 20 shipments are, that's pretty punitive. It's definitely not allowing for much corrective action to occur. So we're going to continue to sort of fight the cause. We field a lot of questions about this particular topic, and the webinar today was really to sort of ensure that everybody is aware that November 1st is going to be another change. And unfortunately, if you get a penalty after November 1st at the first level, that's bad enough. But if you get a second one at $4,000, escalating, and then if they should divide that and say, okay, well, you didn't have your cargo data on file, nor did you have your conveyance data on file, so you're getting an $8,000 penalty in the mail. Pretty punitive. Also, I wanted to mention, which there does seem to be some confusion out there about this, but November 1st applies specifically to the carriers. But there are some upcoming changes that are coming to freight forwarders, that manifest filings will now be required by the freight forwarder beginning November the 7th, and effective January 11th, 2017 to July 11th, 2017, that same group of freight forwarders could receive a non-compliant notice in the mail, which would be those zero-rated penalties that some carriers received from July of last year through to January 11th of this year. And effective November 7th, carriers may be held at the border for manifest issues applicable to those freight forwarder shipments. Carrier manifests must have a consolidated flag that is set to yes to let customs know that the freight forwarder's manifest accompanies the carrier's manifest. And if no consolidated flag is sent, the carrier's manifest then might be rejected. Honestly, we're going to probably do a separate webinar on this because we have some parties that have already put out a notice when I don't feel it even applies to their business model. So we need to get some of those things sort of clarified. I personally don't believe this particular initiative is going to impact too many carriers unless you're hauling freight that's for deconsolidation. Commonly that freight moves in bond and will be broken down at a freight forwarder's location. Then these new rules may apply to you. And again, there's going to be some updates that will be coming. The good news is BorderConnect, as usual, is has all these consolidated flags and things in place for you to meet the requirement. We just have to, I think, get some clarification from people that are putting out a notice to the carrier community whether this really does apply, and how's a carrier supposed to know if the freight forwarder hits this consolidated flag and you arrive at the port and suddenly your manifest is being held up. As well, there's a meeting next Tuesday at the Windsor port. It's one of the first customs meetings that we're going to be able to have since the summer break. So there's a number of points that we're going to be trying to get some clarification on that really are at the port level, and hopefully maybe get that port level direction moved up to Ottawa so that, again, we don't see inconsistencies from port to port. So this would be a good time, if you haven't already submitted your questions, if you should have any questions as it relates to the information contained in this webinar. I'm not going to field sort of a, this is my opinion. I know we're all very upset about this. I hear it loud and clear, and it is one of the reasons that we've taken the approach that we have. But I definitely invite anybody that wants to talk to me after the webinar, please feel free to give us a call. But if you have any questions about the information we've provided in this webinar, I would be happy to answer, or potentially, if we don't have an answer to the question, at least minimally mark it down and then get back to you with some clarification, or we'll post something further to this webinar which clarifies some of those questions, because again, this is still relatively new information.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, we do have a couple questions here from Barry. The first one is Barry would like you to expand on the private carrier, especially since CBSA is not issuing carrier codes to private carriers transporting their own goods, and hence they cannot submit an ACI declaration. CBSA expects the importer or carrier to obtain a hand-carried goods declaration. Is there a difference in the interpretation of a private carrier in different regions?
Okay, Barry, that is a sort of was an issue at one time. When Customs first came out with the hand carry rule, and you're absolutely correct, they were trying to define the difference between private and potentially commercial or for hire. And in fact, they've sort of backed off on that. It has been many months, and I'll go on record as almost saying maybe up to a year, since we have been refused a carrier code. At one time, if I would make a carrier code application for a private carrier, they would come back with some criteria that needed to be met, and if they didn't meet that, then they were put into that hand carry bucket. But in fact, they are issuing carrier code now to almost anybody that makes that application so that they can do that filing. In the reverse to that, we've had issues where a hand carry then has arrived at the border and still able to function under that because maybe that's what they were told, but now Customs are coming back to them and stating that they don't actually qualify for hand carry because maybe there's more than 5 shipments per year sort of against their history. So it's one of those things that are still, I guess the hand carry rule is still there, the regulation is still there, you can still take that exception or exemption about hand carry, but there is still the ability to get a carrier code and file the e-manifest and ensure that you're avoiding that, and we do that on a regular basis today.
Thank you, Debbie. Hopefully, Barry, that answers your question. And as always, as Debbie mentioned, you can call us 24/7 at 1-800-596-5176 or just send her an email to consulting@borderconnect.com. Barry also has another question. He wants to know if we've seen any penalties for incorrect ETAs or ETAs that haven't been revised in time.
Barry, no. As of right now, there is that warning message that may come out that says, you know, there's not been enough or adequate time. I apologize, I don't remember exactly, but it does, there is a message that will come through when it's submitted and the ETA is still maybe not been corrected, whether it's too short a period of time or it arrived prior to. We've had no penalty action, and it doesn't, at this point, reset the clock as well or require a reset of the clock. So if you amend that particular data, it's not resetting the clock and potentially putting you into a penalty scenario. I don't really expect that that's going to change, at least in the very near future, but if we do receive any kind of updates where penalties could potentially be issued for inaccurate ETAs or providing details similar to that are incorrect, we'll definitely you know, address it. But at this point, we've been assured, and this has come up with conversation with various parties that are managing the AMPS to indicate that there are no AMPS yet for those kind of details.
Okay, the next question is from Catherine. Catherine wants to verify that as a carrier, they do not need to send paperwork for your CSA shipment.
Okay, let's clarify. A CSA release option a CSA is simply putting 3 barcoded data elements on file with Canada Border Service Agency. So the carrier code must be presented in a barcoded fashion. The customs would scan that notifies and confirms that the carrier is approved for CSA. The next barcode or data element that would be scanned is the business number that now associates the goods that are on the truck are being reported and will be accounted for by an approved CSA importer. And then the driver must have a FAST or a CDRP card, which again are considered those 3 elements. Now, as far as paperwork, the driver still needs to have paperwork in case of inspection or that customs may want to review the details, but there's no paperwork having to be submitted to, for example, a customs broker, because that release option is based on all that pre-approval and the fact that that importer is going to account for those goods and the duty and taxes that might be associated in another CSA reporting format. But at the same time, if you are doing, and CSA remains exempt from the ACI requirements. So if you have a CSA shipment and you're identifying that CSA shipment with what we call that CSA lead sheet, and all 3 of those elements are in place, the carrier code is correct and is approved, the importer and that business number, and the driver having that FAST or CDRP card, you're not having to submit electronically e-manifest. You can, though, select to do that electronically and then are subject to all the same rules that would apply. The 1 hour prior to arrival rule still applies. There still would be no need to send to a broker or anywhere else, and you're not submitting any kind of paperwork to customs in advance. It's all done through that electronic. My opinion, any CSA approved carrier with CSA goods on that truck that qualify for that CSA release option, definitely do it as CSA so that you're exempt from all of this and potentially exempt, obviously, from the penalty actions that may also be associated to ACI.
Yeah, we hope that answers your question. The next question is from Karina, and Karina wants to know if the PowerPoint presentation will be made available. Yes, it will. At the conclusion of the webinar, I will be sending out an email to all attendees with the PDF attachment that includes the full PowerPoint presentation. And also, if you are watching from a computer right now, you can see that tutorial videos are available. And in the next few business days, I will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel. So I highly recommend subscribing to our YouTube channel, and the link is right there on the slide in front of you. The next question is from Mary. Mary is asking, how long does it take for customs to issue an AMPS penalty after the infraction?
Mary, this sort of varies. Currently, and I should explain that, customs are reviewing all referrals that come from the port are being submitted to a centralized location, and that centralized location is actually issuing the penalty action. We've probably seen anywhere from probably best case 10 business days just to allow for the mailing and the receipt of that penalty, because it will come by registered mail. I've seen some that were, talking about they were received, let's say, in May and referencing an infraction that occurred in March. So there is some inconsistencies. Some other confusion that we have is that the driver may report back to dispatch to say, okay, the customs officer has advised me there won't be a penalty issued this time. And then, in fact, the company gets the penalty in the mail a little further down the road. It's really because of this centralized process that they're currently doing. At some point, they do expect to put this back down to each of the port levels, where the ports would be responsible for the issue of penalty, similar to all the other prior to ACI penalty was issued at a port level. And I suspect when we see those port level penalties come back into play regarding ACI, we're going to see maybe a quicker turnaround and maybe not quite as taking quite as long as it might take under this review process. So it's sort of it's still a process that is, you know, I can't clearly tell you, well, if you haven't received a penalty within 6 weeks of the occurrence, you're not liable to get one. There's still some inconsistencies in that timing and getting that information out. And keep in mind, if they're mailing a penalty, a registered mail penalty to the U.S., it may take longer than a penalty that might be received to, you know, within Canada. But the penalty action is coming in the form of a registered letter with a paper notice of penalty that you would receive if you receive one.
Thank you, Debbie. The next question is from Gail. Gail states, we have already received a notice of penalty assessment for arriving at the border prior to the 1 hour. Will our record be clear as of November 1st, or are we automatically subject to the level 2 penalty, being we have already received this one?
I did ask for that clarification when this notice came out, and I was advised that those notices of penalties that have been issued are on file, are against your record, and will not be sort of considered clean. As of January 11th, 2016, any of the carriers that may have had a zero-rated penalty went back to sort of a clean record, the same as those that may not have received it. But if you have received a $2,000 penalty to date, then you need to stay compliant 12 months from when that occurrence occurred, because you will be subject after November 1st. If you have an incident of noncompliance, you will go to that second level. And unfortunately, if you have another one before December 1st or after December 1st, not prior to, but after December 1st, and again within that 12-month period, you could be at level 3. So yes, it is going against your record currently.
Gail has provided some more information to add to that. She states that the penalty was only for $1,250.
Okay, so obviously the circumstances regarding each, there's a number of different contraventions, although we've more commonly seen the penalty 378 or the contravention number 378 being issued, which is at that $2,000. If you should receive a contravention of 378 in your case, which obviously was not the $2,000 and you received a different one, then you would stay at level 1 because you've not received that specific contravention. But if whatever that incident was that caused that contravention that is associated with that $1,250 amount, if you were received that one after December 1st or November 1st, that's when you're going to go to a level 2 and then a level 3. So yes, it's based on the contravention number and staying compliant by contravention numbers. But unfortunately, Customs have issued a very high number of contravention 378, which is at that highest level of $2,000. And those are the ones that everybody is most concerned about.
All right, Evan has asked, is there more info on the upcoming webinar, and will I be able to register on BorderConnect again? Yes. What I would suggest doing is we don't have a date set for the next webinar. However, we will be, I would guess it would be fairly soon. But I would suggest doing is going to our Facebook. We always upload news, or whenever a webinar or something like that is going to be released, you'll have a registration there on our Facebook page. or you can go to our homepage, BorderConnect.com, and on the top right-hand side, there is a menu option that says Events, and we post our upcoming events and webinars well before they're actually going to be aired. Also, I will be sending out an invite to anybody who attended today's webinar. I'm going to send an invite to when our next webinar will be scheduled, so there will be a registration link included in that email. I hope that answers your question, Evan. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Debbie? Okay, give me 1 second. I'll put you through to Debbie here.
Thank you, Justin. I just wanted to add, for those of you that are attending, keep in mind this is still a, relatively a program and a process that is, literally in development. Things continue to change. We continue to hear updates and will provide those update notices. So don't take away from this webinar that this is going to happen as of November 1st, because we're still hopefully lobbying so that there will be some consideration. Again, we've requested by Customs that they look at a process that would allow every carrier to have at least minimally a warning before, a written warning before they might get a penalty. We've requested maybe some consideration to that written warning coming with a 0 rated penalty, and that once you have one of those on file, then the next would be another indication of non-compliance, so that there just needs to be some consideration, and especially under the current regulation as it is right now, that unfortunately there's no room to say to Customs, look, we simply made a human error here, can't you give us a break? And that the regulation doesn't allow for that currently. So we need those regulations to change in order to hopefully make this a little, and I would personally like to see their penalty system be more in line with the U.S. system, which allows for mitigation meaning lowering the penalty. Customs' attitude is they've actually mitigated all the penalties that have come in, because they could have issued those penalties maybe ×2 for the conveyance and the cargo, or they may have seen that based on your history you had a number of other infractions, and they've only hit you with the $2,000. The carrier that's received a $2,000 notice in the mail and now subject to paying that $2,000 does feel that it's punitive and not necessarily corrective, and maybe that mistake warranted a little bit lower penalty amount than at the highest level where it's considered a security risk. So keep monitoring our web page. We will, as Justin said, continue to provide some information. We will continue to provide updates. Each webinar that's on similar topics often include updated information, so don't say, well, I've seen that one, because there could be some other piece of valuable information. And the fact that it's out there, that you can listen to the webinar afterwards or watch it, it's definitely available, and we're just and I'm always happy to receive information or a phone call that can help the carrier industry as an entirety to hopefully move information to Customs and try to, or to other associations, just to ensure that we get this where it doesn't potentially, I've heard carriers say to me, I'm not going to be able to cross the border anymore, I'm going to start contracting out to somebody else, let them have this problem. No matter what we do, this is going to have an impact, and it really comes down to having an impact to all of us, because commonly goods that get to market are by truck, and if the if the carrier community can't do business, what's going to happen? So anyways, that's my 2 cents for today.
Sorry to pop this up on you, Debbie, but it looks like we have another question here from Kaylee. Kaylee asks, in what situation would an LTL carrier receive a fine for each shipment? And would arriving before the 1 hour mark qualify for a fine for each shipment?
Kaylee, commonly it's when customs have kind of taken the attitude it's not on file. So for example, if you had created the e-manifest, you had simply forgot to submit the manifest, and that meant you did not submit the conveyance data, so the data elements associated to what we commonly refer to as the trip, the truck and the trailer information if that's part of the e-manifest, and then per shipment, per PARS, per shipment that might be on board, then yes, in the future and after November 1st, you could actually be receiving a penalty that would be for each shipment. Now, it says customs notice says may be issued, but unfortunately, customs have indicated that the $2,000 base is probably going away, and for each level of noncompliance, after this amount of time, they're probably moving towards where you would receive penalty for each violation. And if you didn't submit a manifest on that entire truck and that entire trip, then that's where you could be subject. So it puts the LTL carrier or carriers that commonly have more than one shipment even at a higher level of risk for penalty action, definitely.
All right, thank you very much, Debbie. Hopefully that answers all your questions. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. For all the attendees, we will be emailing a PDF copy of today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as uploading it to our YouTube channel in about 2 to 3 business days. So feel free to share it with colleagues and coworkers. For those who have not registered for BorderConnect's ACE and ACI e-manifest software, you can register today for a free 30-day software trial at www.borderconnect.com. or call us 24/7 at 1-800-596-5176. Also, like I said, subscribe to BorderConnect on Facebook and YouTube to stay up to date on the latest customs news, software updates, and tutorial videos. And as well, you can access the full library of BorderConnect webinars. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.